Hi everyone, this is the Modulate wrap-up video. We're going to talk about 3 questions again. The first one's by Parker LeBaron. He says, Antigone talks about how a lot of feminist writing isn't part of the real world. Of international relations, and those works done by women are hidden because they are about military prostitution or home-based labor. Is it possible that these works are hidden because they are difficult to read? Not just because they are considered feminist. The same about slavery within terrorism or male rape in refugee camps are written, but also hidden. And I think it's a solid question, and in me it prompts one other question, right? In me it prompts the question, why is it so difficult to read, right? There's a lot of answers for that, right? Maybe the violence, right? Is that considered more violent than like nuclear war? So if it's okay for us to talk about nuclear war in the sort of beginning of international relations, right, it's built on writing and talking about strategy and ways to avoid or ways to win nuclear war, is that less violent? So I know you're not giving me the violence. But you're saying it's more difficult to read, and I'm sort of reading into that, wondering why it's more difficult to read. Actually, the first thing I thought when I read this question earlier and I saw difficult to read, I thought, yeah, actually, like feminism, feminist IR is more difficult, I think, for me, right, to understand, because oftentimes the approach that they take in writing and in studying is sort of counter mainstream approach. It's because it's such a different approach, right? Because they're talking about things, as Antigone herself says, right, that are maybe more to do with sociology. They're talking about sort of language. They're talking about gender. They're talking about practices. This perhaps is perhaps those who study international relations are less used to reading that, right? They're less familiar with those sorts of terms and less familiar with that sort of language. And so that might make it more difficult to read as well. So maybe not just the content, right, which is what I think I started with, but maybe the form that it takes, right? Which, of course, I'm not saying that's not related to content. Content, of course, it is. So that might be another reason why it's not. Of course, if you're a feminist, you might say, look, well, the fact that this is less mainstream, the fact that this is a less common way of talking about international relations and harder to understand, means that the way to overcome that, right, the way to make it easier to read, the way to make it more common is to write more of it and assign more of it in classes and that sort of thing, to grow the audience, right, to have us more used to reading this sort of a thing. So yes, those are some things to think about in terms of the real world. Which, yes, Antigone, we hear quite a bit about the real world or real worlds, right? So Antigone does sort of suggest that there is this whole other world over here that we haven't really seen, right? Maybe because of some of the reasons that either of those 2 reasons that we've mentioned, or maybe because of a reason that you have as well. Parker, who wrote the question, thank you for the question. Maybe that's why it's not read. But there are these other worlds out there that traditional international relations literature is not taking into consideration, and that brings up some other questions too, right? Sort of in the same vein as Parker's, right? Why? At what point do we say, look, this is a great sociology question, right? This is a great anthropological question, or this is a great I've run out of history question. I don't know, but this is not really what international relations is about. And certainly there have been attempts. Robert Cohen famously makes an attempt to do that, to say, look, you have some. That's not international relations, right? That's outside of the bounds of international relations. The fact that it's hidden in international relations is not any kind of nefarious attempt to try and marginalize women. It's that simply that's not what we mean by international relations. But of course, that doesn't make feminism go away, right? And that doesn't make them any less determined. Because why isn't international relations about that is the question that will come back. Why isn't it about military prostitution? Why isn't it about home-based labor? Don't these have an international dimension to them? Of course they do. Don't they have a security element to them? Of course they do. And so and in another class that I've taught in the past, which is more, it's what is it called? Security, national security. National security, terrorism, and intelligence, I think. And I focus much more on this idea of security, right? And how far can we stretch security? Because there's a traditional view of what security means in international relations, and that tends to be state security, right? The security of the nation state, the ability to defend itself, to win wars, to have a foreign policy. But partly because that sort of security has been bolstered quite a lot in the world. We see a lot of war, but we don't see a lot of interstate war. Not a lot of it. In comparison with the 20th century, we don't see a lot of it. So this idea of going past that idea of security, perhaps because that security is being secured, I suppose. Now we're going to go into something like, the security of individuals within states, right? And then specific individuals, right, or specific groups of individuals, like women, right? The security of women. And so, if we can do that, and if we're willing to go with security along that path to sort of an ever sort of broadening idea of what security means, then we absolutely end up at a feminist sort of position where we start to talk about the security of women during conflict or even during peacetime. Okay. But those are the sort of judgments that I think IR scholars make, that they think about, that they either say, look, that's beyond the scope of international relations, that's beyond the scope of world politics, that's something else, that's sociology or women's studies, perhaps, right? Something like that. But of course, feminists say, no, this is as much a part of security and as much a part of international relations as any of the things that you're talking about. Similarly, as I started this answer, right, this is just as violent, or the things that you're studying, the war conflict is just as violent, just as upsetting as the stuff that we're studying. Nuclear holocaust versus military prostitution, right? It's as upsetting. So yes. And the thing at the end, Parker, the thing about slavery within terrorism or male rape in refugee camps are written but also hidden. This idea of male rape in particular, which of course is as difficult a question as any, but it reminds me of what Tickner says here. She says, gender is not just about femininity. So, which complicates things for me, right? I always want to think about feminism as about women, right? And about women in international relations, and also about feminine traits, right? But then once you get to that feminine traits idea, the idea that men or women can possess traits that are considered feminine, right? Then we start to get it. This feminism is not just about women, right? Or gender in particular is not just about women. And certainly, feminists are interested, I think, primarily in gender in international relations. And to me, there's sort of a path back from feminism towards constructivism. This is, I think, the second question. So let's go there now, because I think we naturally went there, or am I just about to? It's from, the question is from Garrett Rand. And Garrett says this, he says, I understand the idea of misrepresentation within IR, but why does Tickner dichotomize it into masculine and feminine characteristics? I don't know why characteristics belong to one category or the other. not some sort of array. By array, I'm thinking sort of like a spectrum there, right? Perhaps. So there's not a hard, because you used the word dichotomize earlier, right? You're trying to say, or you are saying, you communicate that there's not an easy distinction, right? Like a discrete cutoff point where one thing is feminine or masculine. That's what I see challenging there, which I think is interesting. I completely agree with diversity in national leadership, gender or race, and I think don't get too, and certainly you're not, but this is for everybody, right? When you're thinking about feminism in IR, don't think too much. Try not to equate it too much with sort of diversity in national leadership. This is just a small point, side point that you're making in this question, but it is much more. Think of it much more about gender in this dichotomy that you already outlined. So I was just wanting some clarity regarding why Trickner. Hopefully that's not some sort of a Freudian slip there with the tricks or something like that, but Tickner it is, and you have it right earlier on in the question, so it's not a big deal. But I thought it was funny that it was Trickner, as if we're being tricked. Believes that there are feminine and masculine agendas working within the IR sphere. So Tickner believes that there are feminine and masculine agendas working within the IR sphere. And I think agendas, I don't quite like that word in this place. I might be misunderstanding your question, but I think given the context of what you have before, I think here's how I would go about talking about that. And it's sort of where we left off. There's a path backwards, right, from feminism to constructivism. Once we start talking about shared knowledge, once we start talking about social constructs, now we have a big opening here for feminism. Because in terms of this dichotomy between masculine and feminine characteristics, this fits very nicely in this idea of a social, what was the word we were just using? Structures, that's it, social structures. So this is one of the things, and I think feminists think this is a very important one, perhaps the most important social structure that exists, right? In some sense, I think we're giving Tickner too much of the blame or the credit, whichever one you would like, for dichotomizing. You said, why does Tickner dichotomize? I think she would argue that, look, this is a dichotomy that already exists, that's shared knowledge, it's a social structure, and it's based on practices. This is what Wendt would talk about, right? What Wendt does talk about, but certainly Tickner would agree. It's based on social practices, right? The way that we've interacted with one another, the way that we've established our society, not just in the laws and the rules that we've set up, but just, those laws and rules, we might see them even from a ground up approach, right? They're just the way that we've dealt with each other, the way that we've treated women and the way that women have treated men over time have institutionalized into all sorts of things. And one of the things that it's sort of ossified into and informed the structure of our international relations between nation states. And so that does lead us to this sort of national leadership focus. But it's a focus that's not really shared by a lot of feminists. I mean, feminism might talk about that a little bit, but what it wants to do a lot more is drill down into the actual practices. Right? What are these practices? So practices such as military prostitution, right, or home-based labor. Right? These are the everyday practices where there is a strong dichotomy, right? There's a role for women and a role for men. There's a social structure that determines the relationship and is a result as well of the relationship between women and men. Yes, between women and men, but that then creates and supports and structures a social structure of gender, right, which defines certain traits as masculine, certain ways of behaving, certain ways of dealing with the world as masculine, and similarly certain ways of thinking and dealing with the world and relating to the world that we've come to see as feminine characteristics, right? It's not that men always possess masculine characteristics and women always possess feminine characteristics, but if a man does exhibit feminine characteristics, that might be something that's called into view, into question, for discussion. Similarly with women, and this is quite easy to sort of point out with somebody like Margaret Thatcher, right, or Angela Merkel, or in this country Hillary Clinton. These ideas of are these women, right? Are these women? Are they really men? Right? Are they acting like men? Do they behave like men? And that's the same as asking, do they exhibit masculine characteristics? And that becomes it doesn't become. I think feminists would argue, and I think it makes sense. I'd be interested to hear an opposing point of view, but it seems to me that you wouldn't usually discuss a woman exhibiting feminine characteristics as remarkable, right? And you wouldn't be discussing a man exhibiting masculine characteristics as unusual, right? You wouldn't remark it; it would be invisible, right? That's sort of part of what feminism is trying to do, is to make this sort of thing visible, right? And question it and undermine it. I think undermine it might be strong, but at least to draw attention to it. Some certainly want to undermine that distinction, right? So, yeah, I've started to go down that road, and now I think, well, maybe it's not the feminists that are trying to undermine it. Maybe you're trying to undermine it, right? You're sort of asking, you're questioning that, right? You're questioning the dichotomy. You have that array, which I'm reading as a spectrum. So, yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit, and it connects feminism a bit to constructivism of Alexander Wendt, which I think is the way that we connect this in. This is not something that liberals are talking about too much in international relations, or realists, right? This would be something that, as I said, Cohen kind of shuns it a little bit, actually, and tries to sort of define a role within international relations for women, right, for feminists, but they would have to give up quite a lot of the feminism part, right, to get into the space that Robert Cohen opens up for them in liberalism, right? So I'd say liberalism, but constructivism seems to be a better match for feminism. But I'd say the difference between constructivism and feminism, though, is that, feminism is interested in one particular social structure, whereas constructivism would be interested in many of those structures, and those structures as structure in and of themselves, like the class, like social structures, rather than the individual manifestations of that. All right. So the last one I think I've chosen is Ashley Montez. It was really interesting this week and she was on 6 with Daniel Green as well. Let's see quickly how long it would take to answer Ashley Montez. It was really interesting to read this week how women do not really have a voice in government and that our societies are predominantly male. I really enjoyed how reference really helped this country to succeed. And I think that's good, right? It is definitely a story of the rise of feminism, right? The rise of feminism in international relations in particular. And again, I think just to point out that we have a strong discussion in this country and in other Western democracies as well. Sweden is a noted example. Britain as well, of course, has this sort of discussion about let's get since the 70s, right? Let's get women into anywhere they want to be in, right? But let's have our institutions, our political institutions. Let's have our military. Let's have journalism, all the professions. Let's have them. Let's have women strongly represented in all of these areas, right? And I think that's not the focus of international relations. When we talk about feminism and international relations, it is much more about gender. It is much more of a theoretical approach, and it's about the way that we study and look at international relations. Of course, I don't think any of them would argue that we shouldn't have women in positions of power or influence. Of course not. And of course, that would be, I think many of them would hope that this would be an outcome of their work. But that's probably not enough for feminism, right? It's probably not enough because it doesn't really address the Margaret Thatchers, right? Where all the narrative around Margaret Thatcher, right? That she, the Iron Lady, right? She's as strong as any man, sort of a thing, right? That sort of illustrates a problem that they're trying to bring to the front. You know, this the sort of the workings of masculine, you know, that she has to adopt masculine traits in order to succeed. You know, what about these feminine traits? And this to me is a big part of the question of feminism, right? And I think actually somebody else has it down here as well. I read this somewhere already today. I don't know where, but you know that you know, are the feminine characteristics in and of themselves, would they be a strong addition to solving international relations type problems like war, international war, trade, conflict, diplomacy, right? So I will just do this Daniel Green one. It's calling me. I actually didn't read it beforehand, so let's see how it goes. Antigone states on, but I just noticed that the 6 is 6, and it feels wrong not to do it since I did Ashley's. Thank you everybody for your questions, by the way. So Daniel asks us, he says, Antigone states on page 268 a list of 3 knowledge projects. I'd like to focus on the third. Third, and by far the most radical and least understood, and we've talked about the sort of misunderstanding or the hiding. It is difficult to understand, and I think there's some benefit somehow there, right? There's some, I think feminists don't want to be easily understood because they want to be giving something that's outside of the normal narrative, right? So anyway, radical and least understood. So I don't think that's at all a problem or something that those feminist scholars would feel slighted by. I think they would be encouraged by that from Antigone. And least understood, reconstructing theory by recognizing gender as an analytical and structural category. And I think that's probably the knowledge project that I associate most with feminism, and that I've been, I suppose, basing the rest of my comments on. Anyway, what would that look like in terms of policy change after she has effectively integrated gender into theories of IR? What results is she looking or expecting to see? Okay, I think we have mentioned this a little bit, but maybe to end with this sort of focus would be interesting. I would be interested to see one policy change or one theoretical approach that would be amenable to this change, so I can better understand the extent of need for that change. This is a good question, and it did warrant some further thought from me. So let's have a quick look. I'm not as well versed on feminist literature as maybe I could be, but let's see if I can have a go at this. With that, looking at this from an international perspective, if the values on one nation, a nation that places great precedence on feminism, do not match with the values of another nation, a nation that does not place a value, will that be enough of a cultural deviation to hinder relations? That's quite a specific question at the end there. So let me see if I can deal with that. But let's see if I can do this middle one. After she's effectively integrated gender into theories of IR, what results is she looking or expecting to see? I like that question very much. And of course we should ask it. We should probably ask it of every theory that we deal with, right? What's the end of realism, right? What does realism want? For example, I'm stalling a little bit because this is an easier question for me, right? What does realism want? Right? It wants us, when we look at international relations, it wants us to know that the thing that's important to take into consideration, and we're trying to guess what the other guys are going to do, or while we're trying to decide ourselves what to do in the international system, the biggest thing that we should have in our mind is interests defined as power, right? So, and I think I did this in the realism video, but if you think about Ukraine, if you think about Russia, what's Russia going to do? Did they really, how interested are they in sort of keeping Ukraine out of Western institutions? well, we can start to think about, well, what are their interests defined as power? What will increase their power? What will decrease their power? That's what they're going to. That's what they're going to do. That's what realism wants us when we analyze international relations. So similarly, what do feminists want? I don't feel particularly qualified to speak for feminists as much as qualified as I am to speak for realists, but for feminists, as I understand it, what they're asking that when we look at international relations, that we don't forget femininity, right? That we don't forget how are our decisions affecting women? How are the decisions of the other guys affecting women? How are they affecting the ability of women's lives to go on? Right? How will this affect the lives of home workers, right? Or military prostitutes? How will these policy decisions affect that? Also, how can we bring in femininity, those feminine traits, right? It's all based on this dichotomy, right? That's a social structure. How can we bring femininity? How can we embrace femininity in our decision making, in the way that we live our lives, our international lives, right? Our lives that impact people all over the globe? How can we exhibit and cultivate and grow maybe feminine traits? How can they help? So I think that's that's fair. And certainly, as I said, I'm not a feminist, but certainly, and so that I haven't read as much as I to understand any deeper than this. But I think that would be a fair starting place. Anyway. So I'd be interested in one policy change or one theoretical approach, and I think I've covered maybe the theoretical approach, right? That would be amenable to this change, so I can better understand the extent, the need for that change. In terms of one policy change or something, I think maybe in terms of the way that we conduct conflict, like the way that we, I think I read something in graduate school about this, and I'm not sure it was really a feminist piece, but if we think about smart bombs, the sort of concept behind smart bombs is that we can most efficiently and most effectively destroy things, and perhaps part of it is limiting the loss of innocent lives in the process, right? Because it's targeted smart bombs. This was a huge thing in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And of course, it's still important, but we don't talk about it as much as we take it more for granted now, perhaps. Right? But this sort of pinpoint accuracy, this ability to control very destructive tools, right? Like bombs and missiles. I'm thinking missiles, explosives that we can direct and that will damage the thing that we want to damage and not damage anything around. If we think of sort of a dichotomy between masculine and feminine, right? Masculine, this is quite, I don't feel completely comfortable with this, with the example I'm about to give, right? This dichotomy that I'm about to give, but some people might say this, right? Some people might say, oh, masculinity is destructive, femininity is nurturing and creative. Right? That wouldn't be too far from a some might object, I might object, right? But it wouldn't be too far from the views of I'm sure some feminists, I hope. And so we'd say, look, this idea, right? This idea of a missile that can destroy under the control, the rational control of is a very masculine idea, right? And so to come up with that and so what's the alternative to that? The problem with that is like, okay, so now we sort of asking, well, what do you want us to do when we're going to blow something up, right? And of course, that's maybe a very masculine, perhaps a masculine trait, right? The idea of, hey, we have to have some logical and rational way to do the thing, and the thing that we want to do is blow it up, so we have to have some other way. If not the smart bombs, then what? Right? And so then, is there instead something that we can And again, maybe I'm not as in touch with femininity as I could be, but is there something that we can create? Is there something that we can nurture, right, that will have a different effect, right? Not the same effect, because again, the effect that we want is also gendered, right? And so it's trying to offer this very different, very radical way of looking at the world that we can't currently see, that I would struggle to see, right? That many of us, probably all of us would struggle to see. But that's what feminist IR theory offers us, right? If we want to go and expand the world and see the hidden worlds that exist, read some more feminism. All right. So I'll leave you with that. Those are my attempts at answering some of your very good questions. Thank you again, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Daniel and Ashley, for those last two. And I will post this right now.